The flashing red and blue lights didn't just illuminate the street. They exposed a lifetime of arrogance collapsing in real time. Cameras clicked like gunfire, reporters shouted over one another, and a crowd gathered behind police barricades, hungry for the fall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Dr. Adrian Hale, celebrated surgeon, hospital board chairman, a man whose name had been etched into the skyline through billion-dollar foundations, stood frozen at the marble steps of his own hospital as two federal agents tightened cold steel cuffs around his wrists. His expensive suit, tailored to perfection, suddenly looked like a costume peeling off a fraud. Sweat glistened at his temples despite the cold night air, and for the first time in decades, his voice failed him. "This is a mistake," he tried to say, but it came out fractured, almost pleading, as though he didn't even believe it himself anymore. The woman standing across from him didn't move. She simply watched, calm, silent, unshaken. And in that moment, as Adrian's empire crumbled under the weight of truth, the entire world would soon learn the one detail that turned this downfall into legend. He had destroyed the very woman who had just destroyed him. 20 years earlier, Adrian Hale wasn't just powerful, he was merciless. Even as a young doctor, his brilliance was undeniable, but so was his cruelty. He didn't just aim to succeed, he needed to dominate. Patients weren't people to him. They were statistics, stepping stones, opportunities to sharpen his reputation. "If they can't afford it, they shouldn't be here," he had once said coldly in a staff meeting, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The younger doctors had shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared challenge him. No one except her. Elena Carter had stood at the far end of the room that day, her hands steady but her eyes burning with quiet defiance. She wasn't wealthy, wasn't connected, and certainly wasn't powerful, but she had something Adrian didn't understand: integrity. "They're not numbers, Dr. Hale," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They're human beings." The room had gone silent. Adrian turned slowly, his lips curling into a faint, dismissive smile. "And that," he replied, stepping closer, his voice dripping with condescension, "is why you'll never rise in this field." That was the beginning of a war Elena didn't even realize she had entered. Adrian made it his mission to break her, not loudly, not obviously, but systematically. Her shifts became longer. Her cases were reassigned. Her evaluations, once stellar, suddenly carried vague criticisms that no one could quite explain. "You lack decisiveness," one report read. "Your emotional involvement clouds your judgment," said another. Each word was carefully crafted, designed not just to undermine her career, but to erode her confidence. But Elena didn't break. Not then. The real cruelty came months later, on a night that would define everything. A pregnant woman had been rushed into the emergency room, her condition critical, her husband pacing the hallway with desperation written across his face. Elena had been the first to respond, her hands moving with urgency and precision as she assessed the situation. "We need to operate immediately," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. But the decision wasn't hers to make. Adrian arrived moments later, his presence instantly shifting the atmosphere. He glanced at the chart, then at the husband. "Assurance?" he asked flatly. The man hesitated. "We were trying to sort it out," he stammered. Adrian's expression didn't change. "Then there's nothing to discuss." Elena felt her stomach drop. "She won't make it if we wait," she said, stepping forward. Adrian turned to her, his gaze cold, almost amused. "Then I suggest you learn the difference between medicine and charity." "Adrian," she started, but he cut her off sharply. "Dr. Hale," he corrected, his voice firm, a reminder of hierarchy. "And unless you're prepared to personally cover the cost of this operation, step aside." The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena looked at the patient, at the husband whose hope was slipping away with every second, and then back at Adrian. "This isn't right," she whispered. "No," Adrian replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "This is reality." By the time Elena made the decision to act on her own, it was too late. The woman died, and something inside Elena died with her. That night didn't just haunt her, it reshaped her. She resigned days later, her career in ruins, her reputation quietly dismantled by the same man who had orchestrated it all. "You're making a mistake," Adrian had told her when she handed in her resignation, his voice almost bored. "You'll never recover from this." Elena didn't respond. She simply walked away, her silence carrying a weight he couldn't understand. For Adrian, it was just another victory, another obstacle removed. Another reminder that in his world power wasn't just about skill, it was about control. Years passed and Adrian's empire grew. Hospitals, research centers, international partnerships, his name became synonymous with excellence. But behind the polished image was the same man, unchanged, unchallenged, untouchable. Until the day she returned. It began quietly. A new doctor joining the hospital staff, Dr. Alina Carter. The name didn't mean anything to most people. Why would it? Time had a way of erasing the past, of burying inconvenient truths beneath layers of success. But when Adrian saw her name on the roster, something stirred, a flicker of recognition he couldn't quite place. He didn't think much of it at first, not until he saw her. She stood in the hallway, reviewing a patient file, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She looked different, stronger, sharper, as though the years hadn't broken her but forged her into something unrecognizable. Adrian approached slowly, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "Alina Carter," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. She looked up, and for a brief moment time seemed to pause. There was no shock in her eyes, no anger, no fear, just calm. "Dr. Hale," she replied evenly. The familiarity in her tone unsettled him more than he expected. "We've met before," he said, studying her closely. "Yes," she said, "we have." But she didn't elaborate, and that was the first crack. Adrian wasn't used to uncertainty. He wasn't used to being the one searching for answers. Yet something about her presence disrupted his usual confidence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Still, arrogance is a powerful shield. "If you're expecting things to be different this time," he said, his voice carrying a faint edge, "they won't be." Alina closed the file slowly, her movements deliberate. "Oh, I don't expect anything to be different," she said. "I expect things to be exactly the same." He frowned slightly, unable to decipher the meaning behind her words. And for the first time in years, Adrian Hale felt something he couldn't control. A quiet, creeping unease. But arrogance blinded him just as it always had. Because if he had looked closer, if he had truly paid attention, he might have noticed the subtle changes already unfolding around him. The staff who no longer looked at him with the same unquestioning admiration. The financial reports that carried discrepancies too small to alarm but too precise to ignore. The quiet whispers in hallways that stopped the moment he entered. He might have realized that Alina Carter hadn't come back for a job. She had come back for something else. Something far more dangerous than revenge. Justice. And Adrian Hale, for all his power, had no idea that the woman he once destroyed was about to dismantle everything he had built, piece by piece, without raising her voice, without losing her calm, and without giving him a single chance to stop her. Because the real storm doesn't announce itself. It waits. It watches. And when it finally arrives, it leaves nothing behind. The unease didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in quietly, like a whisper Adrian Hale couldn't quite silence, no matter how loudly he tried to assert control over everything around him. At first, it was small, so insignificant that any other man might have dismissed it entirely. But Adrian wasn't any other man. He had built his empire on precision, on noticing the slightest deviation, the smallest flaw. And now, something was off. It began with a phone call. Adrian stood in his glass-walled office overlooking the city, the skyline stretching endlessly beneath him like a kingdom he owned. The phone buzzed once, sharp and intrusive. He glanced at the screen, irritation flickering across his face. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something subtle and inexplicable made him answer. "This is Dr. Hale." Silence. Then a voice, calm, measured, unfamiliar, yet carrying a weight that pressed against his chest. "It's interesting," the voice said, "how some decisions echo longer than others." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Who is this?" A faint pause, then, "Someone who remembers." The line went dead. For a moment Adrian stood still, the phone still pressed against his ear, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. He slowly lowered it, his expression hardening. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath, tossing the phone onto his desk as though the call meant nothing. But it did. Because for the rest of the day he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not physically, not obviously, but strategically, like someone was moving pieces on a board he didn't even know he was playing on. And then came the first crack in his empire. It appeared in the financial reports. Adrian didn't usually concern himself with minor numbers. That was what teams were for, but this wasn't minor, not to him. There was a discrepancy, small, almost invisible, a fraction of a percentage. But it was precise, too precise. He flipped through the reports again, his eyes narrowing. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. His assistant shifted uncomfortably across from him. "It's likely just a clerical error, Dr. Hale." "No," Adrian said sharply, his voice cutting through the air. "Errors are messy. This is clean, intentional, calculated." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling as his mind raced. Someone had touched his system, not broken it, not sabotaged it. Just nudged it, and that was far more dangerous. "Fix it," he said coldly, sliding the report back across the desk. But as his assistant hurried out, Adrian's gaze drifted toward the window again, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in years, he didn't like what he saw, because uncertainty didn't belong in his world. And yet it was growing, slowly, deliberately, and at the center of it all was her, Elena Carter. She moved through the hospital like nothing had changed, her calm demeanor almost unsettling in its consistency. She didn't challenge Adrian directly. She didn't argue, she didn't resist, she observed. And every now and then she would say something so subtle, so controlled, that it lingered long after the conversation ended. "You've expanded the cardiac wing," she remarked one afternoon as they crossed paths in the corridor. Adrian barely glanced at her. "Yes, efficiency demands growth." "Of course," she replied softly, "efficiency." There was something in the way she said it that made him pause, not the word, the tone, as though she knew something he didn't. But when he turned to look at her, she was already walking away. That was the pattern. She never lingered, never pushed, just enough to make him think. And it was working, because Adrian Hale, who had once controlled every room he entered, was beginning to feel like he was losing control of something he couldn't even see. The second blow came days later. This time it wasn't subtle, it was a direct hit. Adrian was in the middle of a board meeting when his phone vibrated again. He ignored it at first, continuing his presentation with the same polished confidence he had perfected over the years. But the vibration didn't stop. Once, twice, 3 times. A flicker of irritation crossed his face as he finally glanced down. His bank. He excused himself, stepping out of the room with a forced smile. The moment the door closed behind him, his expression hardened as he answered the call. "What is it?" "Dr. Hale," the voice on the other end said, strained, uneasy. "There's been an issue with one of your accounts." Adrian's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of issue?" "A temporary hold. It's likely procedural." "But procedural," Adrian snapped. "On my account?" "Yes, sir. It appears there's been a compliance review triggered." "By who?" A pause. "We're still investigating that." Adrian ended the call without another word, his pulse beginning to pound in his ears. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't random. This was targeted. And for the first time, the thought formed clearly in his mind. Someone was coming after him. The realization should have triggered anger, and it did, but beneath it something else stirred, something colder. Fear. But Adrian Hale didn't accept fear. He crushed it, controlled it, turned it into action. By the time he re-entered the boardroom, his expression was composed, his voice steady. "We'll continue," he said, as though nothing had happened, but everything had. Because from that moment on, Adrian wasn't just reacting. He was searching. And every path he followed led back to her. It was late evening when he finally confronted Elena directly. The hospital had quieted, the usual chaos replaced by an eerie stillness that made every sound feel amplified. Adrian found her in one of the consultation rooms, reviewing patient notes under the soft glow of a desk lamp. He didn't knock. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low, controlled. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she finished writing, closed the file, and then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. "Have I?" she asked calmly. Adrian stepped closer, his presence filling the room. The phone call, the financial discrepancies, the bank hold. His gaze locked onto hers. "You expect me to believe that's all coincidence?" Elena studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then quietly she said, "Do you believe in coincidence, Adrian?" The way she said his name, without title, without hesitation, sent a sharp flicker of irritation through him. "Don't play games with me," he said, his voice tightening. "I'm not," she replied. "Then explain it." She held his gaze, unflinching. And for a moment, she almost looked disappointed. 20 years ago, she said slowly, a woman came into this hospital. She needed help. Adrian's jaw clenched. I don't have time for this. She died, Alina continued, her voice cutting through his interruption like it didn't matter. Not because her condition was untreatable, not because the staff was unqualified, she paused, her eyes never leaving his, but because someone decided she wasn't worth saving. The room seemed to shrink around them. Adrian felt it, that shift, that pull. He forced himself to remain steady. You're still holding on to that, he said, his tone dismissive, though something in his chest tightened despite himself. You walked away, that was your choice. Alina tilted her head slightly, studying him as though she were seeing him clearly for the first time. No, she said softly, that was your choice. The silence that followed was suffocating, because deep down, buried beneath years of justification, of arrogance, of control, Adrian remembered, not the details, not the faces, but the feeling, the moment, and now it was being dragged back into the light, but Alina wasn't done. You told me I'd never recover from it, she continued, her voice calm, steady. Do you remember that? Adrian didn't respond. He couldn't, because for the first time he wasn't sure what to say, and that terrified him more than anything else. Alina took a step closer, her presence no longer quiet, no longer passive. You were wrong, she said. Then she turned, picking up her files as though the conversation was over, as though he wasn't even a threat. And that was the moment Adrian Hale realized something had shifted, not around him, but above him. Because the woman he had once destroyed wasn't standing beneath him anymore. She was standing beyond him. And whatever game she was playing, he was already losing. The room didn't feel the same anymore. It was the hospital's executive conference hall, glass walls, polished oak table, the kind of space designed to project power, certainty, and control. Adrian Hale had stood at the head of that table for years, delivering decisions that shaped lives, fortunes, and reputations without ever once questioning the outcome. This was his domain, his kingdom, but today something was different. The air felt heavier. The silence felt louder. And for the first time, Adrian wasn't the one commanding it. Board members shifted uneasily in their seats, their usual confidence replaced with subtle glances, quiet murmurs, and attention no one dared to address directly. Papers lay untouched in front of them. Screens glowed softly, waiting for something or someone. Adrian stood tall, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm, masking the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. His eyes flicked briefly toward the door, irritation sharpening his features. We're wasting time, he said coldly. If there's nothing substantial to present, I suggest we. The door opened, and everything stopped. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Alina Carter stepped inside, but she wasn't alone. Behind her walked two individuals Adrian didn't recognize immediately, but something about them triggered a quiet alarm in his mind. Their posture, their expressions, the way they carried themselves. This wasn't hospital staff. This was authority. Alina moved forward without hesitation, her steps steady, controlled. There was no rush, no nervousness, just certainty. Adrian felt it, that shift, that invisible line being crossed. What is this? He demanded, his voice firm, though a subtle strain had begun to creep beneath it. Alina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached the table, placed a single file down in front of him, and then finally met his eyes. You wanted an explanation, she said calmly. Here it is. Adrian's gaze dropped to the file, then back to her. You think walking into my boardroom unannounced is acceptable? Her lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but something colder. It's not your boardroom anymore. The words didn't just land, they detonated. A ripple moved through the room, subtle gasps, shifting bodies, the sound of controls slipping through cracks no one had seen forming. Adrian let out a short, disbelieving breath. Careful, Alina, he said, his tone lowering dangerously. You're stepping into territory you don't understand. No, she replied, her voice unwavering. I understand it perfectly. And then she opened the file. The sound of paper sliding against paper echoed louder than it should have. Adrian glanced down, and his world tilted. Legal documents, ownership transfers, audit reports, signatures, his signatures, but not willingly given, acquired, reconstructed, proven. His hospital, the foundation of everything he had built, was no longer fully his. The silence that followed was absolute, total, crushing. How? The word slipped from his lips before he could stop it. Alina watched him carefully as though observing a patient whose condition had finally become critical. "You built your empire on leverage," she said quietly. "On pressure. On forcing people into corners where they had no choice but to comply." She leaned slightly forward, her voice soft but cutting. "I learned from you." Adrian's chest tightened. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly as if rejecting the reality forming in front of him. "This isn't possible. You don't have the resources, the connections." "I do," she interrupted. And then for the first time she revealed it. "I'm not just Dr. Alina Carter anymore." The room leaned in, every breath, every heartbeat suspended in anticipation. "I'm the majority stakeholder of the Hale Medical Network." The words landed like a gunshot. No one moved, no one spoke, because the impossible had just become real. Adrian stared at her, his mind racing, trying to dismantle what he had just heard, trying to find the flaw, the lie, the weakness. But there wasn't one, because she wasn't bluffing. This is fraud," he said finally, his voice rising slightly, desperation beginning to bleed through the cracks of his control. "You think you can fabricate documents and walk in here like you own everything?" Alina didn't flinch. "I don't think," she said calmly. "I know." One of the men behind her stepped forward, placing a badge gently on the table. "Federal Investigation Unit," he said, his tone measured. "We've been monitoring financial irregularities within your network for the past 18 months, Dr. Hale." 18 months. Adrian's stomach dropped. 18 months of silent observation. 18 months of calculated moves. 18 months of Alina. "You." Adrian's voice faltered as he looked back at her, something raw and unfiltered surfacing in his expression. "You planned this," Alina held his gaze, "for 20 years. The weight of those words crushed the room, because this wasn't revenge fueled by anger. This was something far more terrifying: patience, precision, justice. But Adrian Hale wasn't a man who surrendered. Not yet. The shock faded quickly, replaced by something darker: calculation. "Fine," he said suddenly, straightening his posture, forcing control back into his voice. "You've made your move, congratulations." He gave a slow, sarcastic nod. "But let's not pretend this ends here." Alina said nothing, she simply watched, and that unsettled him even more because she wasn't reacting, she was waiting. Adrian reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with steady hands. "Everything has a price," he said, his tone shifting, smoother now, more familiar. "You didn't get this far without understanding that." He tapped the screen, then looked up at her. "Name it." The room tensed. Even the agents remained still, because this was the Adrian Hale they all knew. The man who solved problems with money, who erased obstacles with power, who truly believed that nothing existed beyond his reach. "Alina," he continued, stepping closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "You want control, you can have it. You want recognition, it's yours. You want to rewrite history." A faint smirk touched his lips. "We can do that too." He leaned in slightly. "But don't make the mistake of thinking you can destroy me," he whispered, "because I will rebuild, and when I do, you won't survive the fallout." The threat hung in the air, sharp, clear, dangerous, but Alina didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react, and then she shook her head, not in fear, not in doubt, in disappointment. "You still don't understand," she said softly. Adrian's expression hardened. "Understand what?" "That this was never about money," she replied. The words hit differently this time because there was something behind them, something final, something irreversible. Adrian's jaw tightened as he straightened again, his patience thinning. "Then what is it about?" he snapped. Alina stepped back slightly, giving him just enough space to feel the distance between them. "It's about consequence." And with that she nodded once. The agents moved, fast, precise. "Unstoppable." "Dr. Adrian Hale," one of them said, his voice echoing through the room, "you are under investigation for financial fraud, medical negligence, and obstruction of justice." The words hit like hammer blows. Adrian took a step back, his mind scrambling to regain control. "This is absurd," he said sharply. We have everything," the agent interrupted calmly. Files were placed on the table, evidence, records, testimonies, years of buried truth exposed. Adrian's eyes darted across the pages, his breath shortening, his composure fracturing piece by piece. "No," he muttered under his breath. "No, this isn't how this ends." But it was already ending, because for every move he had prepared, Alina had prepared 3. For every escape he imagined, she had already closed the door. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Hale realized he wasn't in control of the outcome. He never had been. Because the moment Alina Carter walked back into his world, the ending had already been written. And now, all that was left was for him to face it. The collapse didn't happen slowly. It detonated. By morning, the empire that had taken Adrian Hale decades to build was unraveling at a speed that defied comprehension. News vans lined the streets outside the hospital, satellite dishes pointed skyward like weapons aimed at the truth. Headlines exploded across every major outlet, his name no longer attached to words like brilliant or visionary, but to phrases far more permanent: fraud, negligence, criminal investigation. Inside the building, chaos spread like wildfire. Doctors whispered in corners. Nurses avoided eye contact. Administrators rushed through hallways clutching stacks of files, their faces pale, their voices hushed but urgent. Systems were being audited. Access was being revoked. Doors that had always opened for Adrian Hale without question were now closed, sealed, guarded. And then the agents came back. Not quietly this time, not discreetly. This time they arrived with purpose. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the marble lobby as federal officers swept into the hospital in coordinated motion, their presence undeniable, their authority absolute. Staff froze as they passed, conversations dying mid-sentence, the weight of reality settling over everyone at once. This was real. This was happening. Adrian stood in his office when they entered, his back to the door, staring out at the city that no longer belonged to him. For a brief moment, he didn't turn around. He didn't need to, he knew. "You're early," he said quietly, his voice eerily calm. "We're right on time," one of the agents replied. Adrian exhaled slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the glass, sharp suit, perfect posture, and eyes that no longer carried certainty. Only strain. Only cracks. He turned then, facing them fully, his expression carefully reconstructed, as if sheer will alone could restore control. "You're making a mistake," he said again, but this time it lacked force. It sounded rehearsed, hollow. The agent stepped forward, placing a document on the desk. "This is a warrant for seizure of assets tied to Hale Medical Network," he said, "effective immediately." Adrian's gaze flickered downward. For a second, just a second, something broke. Then he looked up again, sharper now, desperate control clawing its way back to the surface. "You think this is over," he said, his voice tightening. "You think freezing accounts and dragging my name through the media is enough?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "I've survived worse than this." But even as he spoke, his voice betrayed him, because deep down he knew this wasn't something you survived. This was something you answered for. And then, as if summoned by the weight of that truth, she stepped in. Alina Carter. She didn't rush. She didn't speak immediately. She simply entered the room, her presence steady, her gaze unwavering as it settled on Adrian for what felt like the final time. The agent stepped aside, not out of respect, out of recognition. This wasn't their moment, it was hers. Adrian looked at her, something unfamiliar flickering in his expression. Not anger, not arrogance, something quieter, something closer to realization. "You orchestrated all of this," he said, his voice low. Alina didn't deny it. Yes. No hesitation, no apology, just truth. Adrian studied her face, searching perhaps for guilt, for doubt, for something that would make sense of the storm that had overtaken him. But there was none, only calm, only certainty. "You could have taken the money," he said after a moment, his tone shifting, softer now, almost reflective. "You could have walked away with everything." Alina took a slow step closer. "I didn't come for your money," she said. "I know," Adrian replied quietly. And for the first time he didn't argue, because he finally understood, not completely, but enough to feel it, the weight of every decision, every moment he had dismissed, every life he had reduced to numbers, every consequence he had believed would never reach him. "They'll tear you apart in court," he said after a long pause, though the words lacked conviction. Alina's gaze didn't waver. "They already tried," she said softly, and then she stepped back. The distance between them returned. Permanent, final. The agents moved in. This time Adrian didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't threat, because something inside him had shifted, not redemption, not regret, but recognition. As the cold steel closed around his wrists, the sound echoed louder than anything else in the room, final, unavoidable. And just like that, Adrian Hale was no longer the man who controlled everything. He was the man being taken away. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, every camera fixed, every breath held. The air carried a weight that words couldn't fully capture, a mixture of anticipation, anger, and something deeper. Closure. Adrian sat at the defense table, his once impeccable presence diminished but not entirely gone. He still held himself upright, still wore the mask of composure, but it no longer convinced anyone because everyone had seen behind it. Across the room, Alina sat quietly. No spotlight, no performance. Just presence. The trial had been swift but not simple. Evidence had poured in like a flood, financial records, internal communications, testimonies from staff who had once been too afraid to speak. One by one, the truth had surfaced, and with it, the past. The case of the woman who had died 20 years ago was no longer buried. It stood at the center of everything. Her husband took the stand first. His voice shook at the beginning but steadied as he spoke, grief sharpened into something enduring. "I begged them to help her," he said, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the courtroom, somewhere locked in memory. "I told them I'd find a way to pay, I told them anything." His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't even look at her, not really. The silence in the room deepened. Adrian didn't look up. "He made a decision," the man continued, his voice tightening. "And my wife, my child." His words faltered, but he forced them out. "They paid for it." Alina closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to hold the moment, because this was why. Another witness followed, then another. Stories layered over stories, patterns emerging, truth solidifying, until there was nothing left to deny, nothing left to hide. When the judge finally spoke, the room stilled completely. "Dr. Adrian Hale," he began, his voice measured but heavy with authority, "you were entrusted with power, the power to heal, to lead, to protect." He paused, his gaze steady. "Instead, you used that power to exploit, to neglect, and to place profit above human life." Each word landed with weight. "You showed no regard for consequence." A beat. "That ends today." Adrian's hands tightened slightly on the table. "On the charges of financial fraud, medical negligence, and obstruction of justice, this court sentences you to," the pause stretched, every breath held, "28 years in federal prison." The gavel struck. The sound echoed like a final verdict, not just on a man, but on a lifetime of choices. Adrian didn't react immediately. For a moment he simply sat there, staring ahead as though the world had slowed around him. Then slowly he exhaled, not in defiance, not in anger, but in something quieter, something heavier, acceptance. As the officers moved to escort him away, his gaze shifted just once toward Alina. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate, she simply met his eyes. And in that silent exchange, everything that needed to be said was. Years later, the story would be told in different ways. Some would call it revenge, others would call it justice. But those who truly understood knew it was neither. It was consequence, because power doesn't protect you from truth. Money doesn't erase your decisions, and time doesn't forget. It waits, patiently, quietly, for the moment when everything comes back around. And when it does, it doesn't ask. It doesn't warn, it simply delivers.